aplicada. Vamos a iniciar en unos minutos. Este seminario será grabado y posteriormente podrá ser visto a través de la página web del banco. Hoy nos acompaña Lorenzo Casaburi. Permítanme darle la bienvenida en inglés. So our guest today is Lorenzo Casaburi. He's professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich. Lorenzo is going to present the paper Land Rental Markets, Experimental Evidence from Kenya. So please, let's not interrupt him during the first 5 minutes of the presentation. Afterwards, all your comments and questions are, of course, welcome, and you just need to unmute yourselves. Hi again, Lorenzo. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Great. Good afternoon. Thanks very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to present this virtual event, and I hope there will be sometime soon in the future a chance to meet in person as well. But for today, I'm happy to do this online presentation. So I hope you can all see my slides. Let me know if there is any problem. So I'm going to talk about land rental markets in Kenya, using presenting results from a field experiment. And as mentioned, maybe I'll just go through the introduction briefly, but then I will certainly be happy to get your questions, your inputs. So feel free to just jump in at any time to interrupt me if you have questions, clarifications, or inputs. I should mention this is a joint work with Michela Campora, who is a PhD, who's no longer a PhD student, who used to be a PhD student in Zurich, and then recently graduated, and now she's a postdoc at Harvard. And with Jack Willis, who is a assistant professor at Columbia University, and he and I have been working together for quite a while. And so most of my research is on agriculture and on sub-Saharan Africa. Okay? And so one obvious reason for being interested in agriculture, if one cares about economic development in Africa, is the fact that agriculture is arguably the largest sector in many regions, at least in terms of the share of employment. But it's also a relatively unproductive sector. Okay, for instance, the graph on the left shows the evolution of
las narrativas tan duras que a diario vemos en nuestro país. En este momento me acompaña la secretaria.
And so the left graph follows the evolution of agricultural productivity, cereal yields, and shows that it's been quite stagnant on average in the African continent comparing to other macro regions or continents of the world. Okay, and so on one end we have this fact. On the other, we have this fact that the markets in land, in arguably the key agricultural input, function far from perfectly. Maybe rental markets are growing in rural areas, but still work under many frictions. And in many areas, there aren't much sales. The sale markets are very, very sparse. So one question is whether these two facts are related. Could we improve agricultural efficiency, agricultural productivity, if market-based land reallocation were more effective? And this is a topic that is very actively debated. And in particular, for instance, people like Diego Restuccia, macroeconomist working with microdata, have documented that there is very large dispersion in agricultural productivity. And so that some farmers, if you look at data from a range of countries, seem to be doing much better than others, and that there will be large gains from reallocating land from less productive farmers to more productive farmers. On the other hand, other researchers, for instance, Doug Gollin and Chris Udry, two of the most prominent economists working on African economic development, argue that this dispersion mostly reflects measurement error and plot heterogeneity. So either it's just noise, or maybe the fact that some farmers are producing more than others is mostly a consequence of the fact that some farmers have better plots than others. And so there will not be much gains from moving one farmer to another plot, because if the plot is bad, it's going to continue to have poor productivity. Okay? And so this is a debate on which there is actually quite little evidence, and in particular on which experimental evidence is essentially non-existent. And so what do we do in this paper? We provide the first experimental evidence on the effects of incentivizing land rental market participation. More precisely, we present results from a randomized controlled trial in Kenya, where we subsidize landowners to rent out one of their plots. And in doing so, we induce new rentals. We induce rentals that will not have happened without our experiment. And now they happen because we provide these incentives. And so we study who selects into the land markets on the margin. And then we study the effects of these marginal rentals on agricultural investment, on production, and on the outcomes for the owners who rent out part of their land. And so what do we find? So the first set of results focuses on the effects of rentals, on the effects of the experiment on rentals, and on what are the underlying sources of rental market frictions. Okay? We first of all, we find that not everybody is on the margin of renting out, even with a substantial subsidy to do so. I'll be more precise later. And owners, when they are incentivized to rent out, search within a relatively small circle. However, then these induced rentals that are generated continue after these subsidies expire. And so this is consistent with the presence of search costs and learning that the subsidies help to overcome. Now, we can, because of our experiment, we can essentially compare two plots, one that is managed by the owner and one that is managed by the renter, and are otherwise equal because of the randomization. And so we find that in plots that are rented because of the experiment, there is a shift toward cash crops. There is a shift toward more input investment. There is more input investment. And in turn, things like harvest value and total factor productivity increase. And these effects are that are induced by renting out the plot are larger than the ones that we see in another treatment where we give money to the owner that is not tied to rent out the plot. So this is essentially money to potentially improve cultivation for the owner while not changing management of the plot from the owner to the renter. Okay, and then with under a bit more assumptions, we can actually understand where are the gains from reallocation from these land rentals coming from. We find that renters are younger, they are more educated, and they are a bit more market-oriented than the original owners. We see that the gains arise both from changes in production functions and productivity and possibly capital constraints, but not from labor constraints. Or at least we do not have evidence suggesting that labor constraints matter. And one important thing is that while these rentals that are created by the experiment induce benefits, they are not the rentals that would maximize productivity. So there may be other frictions that prevent owners to transfer land toward the most productive renters. So there are benefits, but these benefits are still far from the one that would be obtained from complete reallocation of land or optimal reallocation. On the owners, we don't find much. We see that when we compare owners who rent out one of their plots and owners who don't, we find that owners maybe reduce a bit their non-agricultural labor supply. They basically enjoy the leisure, the money that comes from the rent, but it's not that they start more activities. And importantly, we don't see a decrease, for instance, in food security, right? One concern is that if small farmers give out some of their land, this will have negative consequences in terms of food security, and we don't find that's the case. And so that's the outline for the rest of the presentation. I'm going to give you some minimal background about land rentals in Kenya. I'm going to talk about experimental design. Then I'm going to discuss how the intervention affects rentals, also talking about the persistence of these rentals after the intervention finishes. And then I'm going to talk about the effects of the experimentally induced rentals on agricultural outcomes and what can we learn about the sources of gains from trade from our results. And I'll be very briefly talking about the effects on the owners from the experiment. So this is the roadmap for the rest of the presentation. And yeah, this is, I mean, I guess related literature. I just want to very briefly mention that there's been a growing amount of work using observational methods or quantitative analysis to try to understand the consequences of market-based land reallocation. A couple of papers using natural experiments, but again, very little, actually no experimental evidence around it. And yeah, and then there's a bunch of other related work that I'm going to refer you to the paper if you are interested. Okay. So I realize that while I'm on full screen, I can't really see you, but if you have any questions, again, feel free to step in. This is my introduction, so I've gone through the initial part. Feel free to jump in at any time. Okay.
Lorenzo,
so yeah.
I know you just gave the introduction, but honestly, when I read the introduction of your paper, the first question that came to my mind is like, why a subsidy for the supply side and not a subsidy for the demand side? So that was my first question.
Absolutely. So we thought a lot about this, and this is an excellent question. So let me make two points. The first one is that we wanted to basically incentivize to create new transactions that will not happen without our experiment. And we felt that potential renters kind of already knew where they wanted to get land, and the subsidy will not have had a major first stage. We would have given a lot of inframarginal subsidies and not generating exactly a strong enough first stage to then look at the effect of the rentals on the outcomes. So that's my point. But certainly, I mean, certainly other designs could look at on the renter side. I'm not saying that at a high level this is a better design. And actually, my point is even more broader, and this is the second answer to your question. We don't see subsidies necessarily as a policy relevant intervention here. We are not arguing that the subsidies per se are the best way to induce market transactions. I'm going to come back to this at the end. We just see them as an experimental tool to induce marginal transactions. But for instance, as you will see in the design in a second, there are some features of how we did the experiment that makes the experiment very effective, but that if we did it at scale, it would be very hard to replicate this feature. I will come back to this point when I present the experimental design. Okay. Again, I cannot see you, so I hope I've addressed your question, but feel free to follow up if I have.
Yes. Thank you, Lorenzo. You can continue.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so very minimal background on Kenya, specifically on Western Kenya, which is where this project takes place. This is like private property rights mostly, but imperfect. Like, you know, many people would have a claim on the same land. It would be a bit hard to document titles, etc. But in principle, it's private property rights. The markets exist, so it's not that we are creating a market for the first time. It's more that we are inducing on the margin some people to enter this market. So about 10% of households are active in these markets, consistent with what's found in other countries in the region. Rentals typically last multiple seasons, 1 or 2 years, each year with 2 seasons. And it's all upfront cash payment. So the renters pay in advance. The average plot size is 0.7 acres, about a third of an hectare, so very, very small. And the rental price per acre per season is $30 to $40. And so what I mean when I say that these markets are imperfect, that when you ask owners or renters why they don't participate in the markets, they report concerns about search cost. It's difficult to find the renters. They are concerned that the renters will overexploit the land, that the renters maybe will create land disputes with the owners. They will try to stay longer on the land than they are supposed to. And they also report transaction costs, okay, that they have to pay fees to the chiefs. And on the renter side, it's basically the same. Maybe a couple of things more. They are concerned that there is asymmetric information over land quality. They don't know land quality. It's hard to measure it. So you can think of this cost as a mix of one-off and per period costs. And so what do? We go to 7,000 farmers in about 150 villages, and we collect information on their plots.
Lorenzo,
and, yeah.
There is a question, Juan Esteban.
Yes, just thank you, Lorenzo. Just a quick question: do these frictions include the fact that, I mean, you mentioned a little bit that it may include the fact that renters don't leave the land, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder whether the fact that one of your results is that rentals continue, it is not a reflection of that, right?
Yeah, no, it's not. So this is
okay.
This is an excellent question. It's actually a question that one of our referees asked. And so we went back to the field to check that. And no, like I'm going to come back to this, but basically owners say that while they were very concerned about this ex ante, ex post, this was not a problem at all. And so this is actually, this idea that inducing experimentation may foster learning, because people may have overly pessimistic beliefs about these risks, which is what we find.
Yeah, and I just a quick additional question: the fact that you mentioned that most rentals are renters pay upfront, and is it the case in your experiment? Is that the way it's going to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we go around the 160 villages, and we census, well, kind of census farmers in this area. We collect information on their plots and on what they are planning to do with this plot in the next season, whether they plan to cultivate it, to leave it idle, or to rent it out. And for the rest of the experiment, we focus on farmers with at least 2 plots, which is 75% of these 7,000, more or less. Okay, and then we ask, after they told us what they are planning to do with these plots, we ask, okay, if we offer you a subsidy on the top of the rent that you will get from the renter, would you rent an extra plot among those that you are not planning to rent out? And so you see that this is a design where through data collection, we first figure out which plots will be rented anyway, and we try to subsidize transactions in addition. And that's the kind of thing that at scale would be very hard to do, to go back to, I think, Karel's question earlier. And so there is the subsidy exactly is for this new transaction, not for the ones that would happen anyway. At least in principle, of course, things are a bit more messy than that, but that's the idea. And it's about a 30% subsidy of the average rental rate. So it's a subsidy per acre for a maximum of 3 seasons. And then we restrict the sample to those owners who say yes. So basically, we restrict our sample to potential compliers. And for these owners, we also know which plot they say that they would like to rent if they get the subsidy. So now we call this the target plot, and we know which plot the target plot will be for each owner in our sample before we actually randomize whether these owners receive the rental subsidy, which is our incentive, or not. Okay. And so there is also then a third treatment or a second treatment in addition to treatment control, which is just an unconditional cash drop to the farmer that is not tied to the rental. Okay, so the main treatment is the rental subsidy. The second is an unconditional cash transfer, and the third is a pure control. And so the rental subsidy is paid to the owners if they find our renters. Okay, so we didn't want to. There are many other type of designs, including, as per the previous question, design where we subsidize renters. We have a bunch of reasons to go with this one, but other designs could certainly be interesting for future work. In particular, one implication of this design is that we have counterfactuals for the plot. Like we have basically 2 plots that are identical, but one is going to be rented and one is not going to be rented. We have counterfactuals for owners. So we have 2 owners, one that is induced to rent out one of their plot, and one who is not induced to rent out. So we can do this comparison. But we do not have a counterfactual for renters. So we cannot answer the research question, what is the benefit for potential renters to access a plot to rent from an owner? And that's something I'm exploring in other ongoing work, but it's not it's an important question that we cannot address here. Okay, and then we do data collection for multiple seasons, including for at least 1 season after the end of the experiment, so the 4th season, sorry, after the end of the subsidy. And then actually we also did some short survey, phone surveys. That would be 5 and 6 seasons after the end of intervention, so 2 to 3 years later. There are a bunch of extra details. Let me skip them for now. I may come back to some of these if they're important later. Exactly. And so the point that I want to make is that we are inducing these marginal trades. Okay? And these marginal trades are basically trades that may occur if the value of the land market friction is, let's say, large, but not too large. So it must be large enough that these trades do not happen without our subsidy. But then it has to have some upper bound such that once we introduce the subsidy, the benefits from the rental plus the value of the subsidy are larger than potential frictions that are in the markets, like search cost, expropriation risk, or whatever. Okay? So there will be some combinations of owners, renters that trade even without our experiment, some pairs that never trade even with our experiment, and then there is this intermediate gap, range, where the benefit from trade, which is this delta, is within a certain bound in terms of frictions. So large, but not too large. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's not the case. So now I'm going to go to the first stage. Do we see that this treatment increases rentals? And
Lorenzo, there is a question from Margarita.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. So, quick question. Are there any differences in productivity among farmers with just one plot and farmers with more than 2 plots? Which are the ones you're including?
I don't know that because as soon as they tell us that they have 2 plots, so that they have 1 plot, we stop. So we didn't have an extensive survey with these people. So I cannot answer that question.
Okay.
It's plausible, but I don't know. And the reason for stopping is because we didn't want to induce people who only had 1 plot to rent out their only plot for ethical purposes, for ethical reasons. So that's why we restricted.
Okay.
Yeah. Of course, I mean, I could look at that question on survey, World Bank, LSMS data, where they have representative farmers. That's something that we could do, but not with our.
Yeah, I was just thinking that if it is the case that those with only 1 plot have like lower productivity, those might be the ones that gain more. Like when those rent the land, you would observe like higher effects on aggregate productivity.
Absolutely, that's entirely possible.
Yeah.
Juan Esteban, I see your hand up.
Yeah. Just another quick question. What about renters? Do you know whether renters rent other plots? I mean, do they?
Yeah, so most of these people, I'm gonna come back to this later, but most of these owners and renters that are in our trades are first time on the side of the market. So we use people who have never rented out to rent out for the first time, and people who have not rented in ever to rent in land for the first time.
Okay, but what were they doing before that? You know?
Oh, that's some land. So these are not completely landless people. I'm gonna come back to this.
Okay. Thank you.
Describe. So, but you should think this is not a context. I know the Indian context, which there is large class of landless people. Here you should think that everybody has a bit of land. Okay, and we are moving on intensive margin, not on the 0-1 margin. Okay, and so bunch of things. It's not the case that we say, oh, look, we are going to increase the price at which you can rent out your land by 30%, and everybody jumps on it. It's about 16-17% of farmers who would like to rent out. So a lot of people are not on the margin. This is not surprising, but it's good to document it. And so anything else that I'm going to say in the rest of the presentation is about this group of farmers who are on the margin, who are again a sixth of the total. Yeah, we can do some comparison about which owners are interested in our subsidy versus those who are not. I'm going to refer you to the paper. And a lot of farmers who say that they would be interested in getting our subsidy to rent out a plot, they basically say that they don't have cash enough, or they don't have any inputs to make good use of that plot. Okay. Yeah, then skip. And so, but interestingly, even if our design was intending to identify potential compliers, take-up is still incomplete. Of those who are eventually randomized into the subsidy to rent out one of the plot, 70% takes up, not 100%. Most of these people take up for 3 seasons, so they take the whole package. And what are the main reasons not to take up? About 2/3 try, but they cannot find a renter. And about 1/3 changes their mind. Maybe they told us that they would like to rent out, but then they don't, because they decide to cultivate. And the other treatment, the unconditional cash transfer, basically everybody takes up the subsidy. It's there's no cost in doing that. And so in turn, we do have that our treatment generates a large effect on the likelihood that this target plot is rented out. This is the orange bar. But also in control group, we see that some people rent out even without our subsidy. That's about 20-25%. Okay. Yeah, and interestingly, the terms, like the prices, the duration, etc., are quite similar in the rentals in our treatment group, which are mostly induced by the experiment, and in the rentals in the control group, which would happen even without our experiment. Oh, sorry. And then we find that these rentals, to a large extent, not one-to-one, but to a large extent, persist also in season 4 and 5, so 1 and 2 seasons after the end of the subsidy. And actually, with the phone calls to a subset of respondents, we also find that they persist over a longer time horizon. So season 8 and 9, 2.53 years after the end of the subsidy. And so this suggests two potential sources of land frictions. So one is fixed cost. Like I don't rent initially because it takes time to find a renter. But then once I find one, that relationship continues. And to some extent, that's what we find. People take time to search, on average of 3 weeks. And actually, a fair amount of people try to find a renter, but they fail. They cannot find a renter. And also, search is somewhat limited. We see that maybe in 20% of the cases, renters come from another village from where the owner is. But in most cases, the search is still quite limited within a relatively narrow circle of acquaintances of broad family. Okay? And so I'm going to go back to this point, because from our follow-up data, it doesn't seem that these owners were necessarily trying to look for renters who may be more productive and therefore pay a higher price. They were constraining their search within a relatively small set of potential renters with whom there's some connection before. And the second is learning, which goes back to our previous question. So ex ante, there was a lot of concerns about things like land disputes or soil exploitation or fertilizer use. But after 3-4 years, we call back these owners, and only 4% of them report land disputes. And most of them report that their concerns are now much lower. And interestingly, owners appear to be much less concerned, not only when asked about renting to the renter to whom they've been renting, but also when asked about hypothetical renting out the same plot to somebody new in case the current renter was no longer interested. So they seem to have developed more optimistic expectations about the function of the rental markets comparing to their prior. And then on the other end, also renters appear to learn. For instance, there is some evidence that the rentals that continue are the ones with higher productivity, or that renters learn how to cultivate these plots over time. I'm going to maybe come back to this. Okay, and so just to summarize this part, this evidence suggests that two frictions to land markets are sources of fixed costs, of which search costs seem to be a primary driver, and learning, especially against overly pessimistic beliefs toward the risks of land markets. Okay, so let me skip the equations. They are not important. But basically, at this point, what we want to do is to compare two groups of plots that are ex ante equal, but then because of our experiment, one group is now managed by the renter, and one group is managed by the owner. It's not one-to-one, but for simplicity, think of it this way. Okay. And so, to be slightly more precise, the coefficients here in purple is the coefficient on the owner of that plot receiving a rental subsidy actually being paid. So it's the TOT on our treatment. And the green is the cash drop being paid, and the gray is the difference between the two treatments. So a few things. Both treatments increase the likelihood that the plot is cultivated. About 18% of the plots in the control group are not cultivated, are left idle or fallow. and this likelihood goes down, or the likelihood that the plot is cultivated goes up by 8-9 percentage points. I'll come back to the crop choices later. And then what we see that while the two treatments had similar effects on the likelihood the plot is cultivated, only the treatment, the rental subsidy, which induces a change in who manages the land, only the rental subsidy induces an increase in inputs. These are non-labor inputs, an increase in harvest value, and in turn an increase in value added, value of output minus costs. Interestingly, there is no change in labor costs. So I'm going to come back to this, but renters appear to put more inputs to get higher revenues and value added, but not to put more labor on these plots. And this is a result that we find even basically conditioning on whether the plot is cultivated or not. So the results on revenues or value added or inputs are not driven by the fact that these plots are more likely to be cultivated. I can go more in detail on that if needed. Okay, so arguably important result of the paper, exogenous inducing rentals induces increase in inputs to some extent on revenues and on profits on the farm. And just to give a number, the average harvest value is about $100. This goes up by $40 in the treatment group when a plot is basically rented out. Okay, and so we also do soil quality test, and we don't find a negative impact on soil quality. Yeah. Okay, let me skip this, is not important. And one thing to say also is that there are no spillover effects on the other plots of the owners. So for instance, it is not the case that since the owner is now renting out the plot that we target for the experiment, he's less likely to rent out other plots, primarily because they were not renting out any plot before. The likelihood of renting out any other plot in our sample is just 5%, so very small. Okay, so we see some gains from rentals, and where do they come from? There are basically 4 potential mechanisms. So one is technology. And in particular, what we see, I'll go back a few slides now, is that renters are more likely to cultivate cash crops. These would be things like sugarcane, tobacco, groundnuts in these settings. So basically, when the owners get the unconditional cash transfer, they cultivate a bit more the plot, that's the green bar here, but mostly what they do is to cultivate more maize, which is the traditional crop in this area. When a renter takes over the plot, they are much more likely, basically they double the likelihood of cultivating a commercial crop, plus 10 percentage points from a control mean of 9 percentage points. So this essentially doubles. Okay. The other mechanism is also to go back to some previous discussion that I was having with Margarita and others before, there is no consolidation. So these renters are not renters that have a lot of other land and they just get one more plot for that big farm. These are small renters. I actually come back to this. So then we can do the second margin is productivity. Okay. And so we find that rented plots have higher total factor productivity, okay? But also that renters, comparing to owners, have some characteristics that are plausibly correlated with productivity. They are younger, they are more educated, they're also more likely to be male. So maybe from a gender distribution perspective, this intervention is inducing a bit of transfer of land from, let's say, older women to younger men. That's basically one thing that this thing is doing. And so, for instance, when you just... Sorry, is there a question?
No, it doesn't seem to.
Okay. No problem. And so one thing that that you can see, for instance, is that the way you should interpret it is that on average the owners in our sample are, I don't know, 49 years old, and renters are about 5.5 years younger. Or that on average owners have a 24% chance of having completed high school, and this goes up to 34% for renters. Okay. So the third channel would be labor, which would be a classical example, a classical method, right? The idea would be, oh, the owners have a lot of land, but not much labor, and the renters have more labor, maybe more household labor, that they can put on the plot. And we don't find this, meaning that it is the case that these renters, if you look at their endowments, have much higher labor-land ratios. So if you take the ratio of household size over acres of land cultivated, is in baseline higher for renters than for owners. But then the renters do not appear to use more labor on the plots that they rent, comparing to the amount of labor that the owners are putting on comparable plots. And so we don't find evidence that the labor channel is the one driving the increase in harvest value. And then finally, capital. So there is evidence that the owners are capital constrained. For instance, when we give the cash transfer to the owner, they are a bit more likely to cultivate the plot. And on the other hand, at baseline, renters appear to have better access to capital, to formal loans in particular. They appear to be taking some loans from banks to cultivate the target plot. And they, for instance, plant these commercial crops that require more upfront investment. And so this is some evidence that they can access better capital, more capital, to cultivate the plots comparing to renters. To owners, sorry. So these are 4 channels, and again, we find evidence that renters may be more productive because of different technologies, the cash crop, better productivity, and better access to capital, but we don't find evidence consistent with labor constraints being the source of these gains. Yeah, these are just a bunch of results. And so a couple of things that I want to do in the last 5 minutes. Yeah, perfect. And so the first thing that I want to do is to go back to this question. Yeah,
Lorenzo, excuse me, Margarita has a question.
Yeah.
So going back to the capital constraints, do you have a sense of what's the source of the potential credit market constraints, and why do these renters have better credit access than the others?
Yeah, so my sense is that it's a bit related to the age and to just familiarity with the banking system. So the renters are just younger. They seem more integrated with the formal economy. They are actually quite able to get a loan, including from, I need to check the source, but I think including from formal microfinance or formal banks to get a loan. Yeah, so my sense is that these guys are just more entrepreneurial. They are more educated, they're more experienced with the commercial economy, etc. Even if they are arguably a bit poorer, it's not a wealth issue, right? They have less land. So if anything, you will think they have less collateral to get a loan, but nevertheless, they are able to access more capital.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Interesting.
Yeah. Which is a bit, I mean, abstracting a second from the data, that's a story that I hear a lot in the field, that a lot of older people are in agriculture because that's what they've done all their life, but not necessarily because they think of it as an enterprise, a business. While people who take over land, when they do that, they really think of it of, oh, I need to make good money to make the investment worth. But of course, this is much more anecdotal evidence than what we are used to.
Yeah.
Okay, and so this is not super important. Again, the first point is very important. Again, I want to emphasize that most owners are not on the margin. So for a vast majority of owners, any friction to the trade is sufficiently large and much more large than potential gains from trade. Okay, this is important. So that even a 30% subsidy does not move the needle.
Lorenzo,
Excuse
me. Where did this 30% came from? How did you determine that will be the subsidy?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. It wasn't super. It's not that we tried rigorously with multiple amounts. We wanted to have something large enough to induce a sizable share, and so since we did this baseline with 7,000, 16% people interested, we projected it was going to be sufficient to get good power. And then it also seemed that moving that from 30 to, let's say, 40, 50% was not generating much more interest. Okay, so the supply didn't seem super elastic around this part of the distribution. Okay, and we could not do more for budget reasons. So we could not do 100%.
And the other thing that I wonder is, like, why is it that this subsidy induced the rentals? It's because it reduced the transaction cost, or what is kind of like a mechanism?
Yeah, no, that we cannot say. Like, we cannot say ex ante whether 30% works for this 16% of owners because it overcomes such costs, or because it induces people to take a bit more risk, right? Maybe there's some probability that they feel they're going to get into land disputes, but they think, okay, if I'm getting paid 130 instead of 100, it's worth to take this risk, right? That we cannot say cleanly experimentally. Ex post, as I mentioned earlier, it does seem that these search frictions are quite important, and so that the subsidy may induce people to take this friction, to take this cost, and that the subsidy did allow people to experiment and to overcome these potentially overly pessimistic beliefs about the market.
And the other thing that really got my attention that you have mentioned repeatedly is the 16%. I mean, it seems to me that it's like a low percentage of people interested in the subsidy. Why do you think not many owners were interested in renting?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have super strong priors here on what a higher. I didn't have a prior because, like I said, it's a lot of people. If you tell them, oh look, they're gonna get 30% higher rent, would you want to rent an apartment or something? I'm not sure how many people would be on the margin, but I think the right way to interpret it is that whichever friction is there is large enough is larger than any potential gain from trade plus the 30% subsidy. So that actually is a nice lead to the next exercise, which basically we can do a simple back of the envelope to quantify the amount of frictions, and without going in detail. Basically, the amount of friction appears to be, let's say, 50% larger than the rental price in the market. So this is, the rental price was about 30 to 40 per acre per season, $30 to $40. And with the back of the envelope, which rests on many assumptions, so take it with a bit of skepticism, but the frictions in this land market appear to be between $45 and $55, something like that. Okay, so again, consistent with the fact that they're very large. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do is to basically, yeah, exactly. So let me wrap up. Is to basically say, look, in the more macro literature, the standard exercise has been the following. It has been, let's use baseline data to estimate productivity for each farmer in the data, and then let's now simulate how much gains we will get from reallocating land from farmers whose estimated productivity is low to farmers whose estimated productivity is high. Okay? That's a standard exercise on this quantitative land misallocation literature. Okay? And so when we do an experiment,
we have a question here.
Sure.
Carlos.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Just thinking about questions before, I'm thinking about the introduction where you talk about land property rights not being completely formal for all the participants in the experiment. I wonder if that has an effect, and whether you observe, how shadow or how gray, property rights are for the different owners of these plots. Thank you.
Yeah, so very good. We do have that at baseline. Something like 40% of owners say that one reason they don't participate in the market is related to the risk of land disputes. So that's just survey. But an important caveat is that we have this number only for the farmers who are interested in the subsidy. So this is more of a question of why weren't they doing this before? We don't have this question for people who say that they are not interested in the subsidy. And it's possible that the share of people concerned about land disputes would be even larger among those that say that they are not interested in a subsidy. But I don't have our data on that. But again, I want to emphasize that one thing that we find is that these concerns, after we have pushed people to participate in the market, appear to be much smaller, not validated by the experience. Okay, and so essentially, so we can do a similar exercise to this macro literature, and we can say, okay, what would be the total gains that we could induce if we were reallocating land in a productivity optimal way? Okay, this has nothing to do with our experiment. Again, we compute productivity of each farmer, we plug in a production function, and we say, oh, the land should first go to the farmer that is more productive, then to the second most productive farmer, etc. Now, and then we can compare this exercise to our experiment. Okay? And the results can differ for three reasons. The first one is simply that our experiment did not induce a full reallocation, right? Every owner could at most rent out one plot. And so still we find that with our experiment, we reallocate 9% of the land, but only generate 2% of the potential gains. So it's still the case that not only the rentals are fewer because of the design mechanical, but also condition on the amount of rentals, the gains from the rentals of the experiment are actually lower than the optimal rentals that could be used. And so why is this the case? I think, and there are two remaining reasons. The first one is that it's a selection story. If we predict gains based on baseline productivity, we could get very different results than if we actually measure treatment effects experimentally once a certain plot goes from farmer A to farmer B. Okay, we know really what happens, as opposed to say, oh, because the farmer A had a baseline productivity of 10 and farmer B at 20, we expect an increase of 10. We can actually see what happens in the data. And actually, quite strikingly, the baseline prediction does quite well. If the baseline productivities predict that the gain from trade, the gain in productivity should be 15, the estimated effect experimentally is actually not far from it. So the realized gains are actually quite close to the ones that we measure experiment. Sorry, the experimentally realized gains are quite close to the ones that we would predict based on baseline productivity. So that's good news for all these other papers that do this type of quantitative exercise. But the other thing is simply that when we induce rentals, land does not go toward the potential renters with the highest productivity. It goes to renters who are more productive than the current owners, but not the ones that are most productive of all the potential renters. And this goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, that, that owners are really searching within a small set of potential renters, not within the full range of potential renters in village and nearby villages. Okay? Or put in other words, maybe there are out there some renters that will get a lot from this land, but these are also the trades for which there are the largest frictions. And so frictions appear to be positively correlated with gains from trade. And the trade that happens, again, a positive impact, but not the largest possible impact. Okay, so on owners, I will skip. I just want to say that it doesn't appear to be the case that when owners rent out one of their plots, they do much worse. They do worse in terms of food security, which is a big concern in you know, among those that are a bit skeptical about increasing land markets in this area. Okay, so let me conclude and take stock. So we do an experiment where we induced marginal land rentals and study their effects. We find that few owners are marginal, and again, this 16–17%, and that we in the rentals that we induce, there are efficiency gains. There is more output, more commercial crop, more inputs. We find evidence of potential sources of land market frictions, including search cost and learning. We can document potential sources of the gains from the rentals, different in technology, in productivity, and possibly capital constraints, not much driven by labor. Okay? And that while our experimental rentals do induce gains, the predicted gains from the optimal reallocation are much larger. Okay? And this could be because the trade with largest gains are also the ones that have large frictions, large trade frictions. Thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed the talk and I appreciate your questions. And I will be happy to take more questions if there is time.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Well, is there any other question from the audience? Margarita?
So I probably missed this, but is it true that are there any productivity differences among those who self-select into rentals and those that are not induced to rent? Are they like higher or lower productivity?
You mean for owners that are induced to rent out?
Yeah.
No, so that question we cannot answer because we don't have productivity, right? The way you should think is that we do a very quick listing with 7,000 people, in which we just ask, okay, which plots do you have, and how much, and would you like to rent an extra plot if you have the subsidy? Okay. So we don't know and measuring productivity, as you know, is super complicated. So doing a sufficiently good survey with 7,000 people was impossible. We know a bunch of things. We know that those owners who are interested in renting out typically have a bit more plots than those who don't, and have more plots that they are not actively cultivating, consistent with the fact that these owners may not have the resources to invest efficiently. But so the main comparison, right, is given these owners, do we see then an increase in productivity once renters take over these plots? And that's a yes. But the increase in productivity is not as large as could be predicted from optimal reallocation models.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I guess, I mean, the size of the effect is going to depend on who exactly is self-selecting into the market, right? From both the demand side and the supply side. So.
Absolutely. And that's why I think that the policy relevant question is to to focus on marginal trades. If you relax a bit the constraint, who selects on the margin and what are the effects of these marginal trades? I feel that unless you are completely creating a market from scratch, which you are not, the marginal one is the policy relevant question.
Yeah.
So Lorenzo, if I understand correctly the story, once you guys offered the subsidy, some of the owners were willing to offer their land to be rented, and then, okay, renters that were more productive, maybe not the most productive, but more productive than the owners, were able to access to this land, and. Why isn't this resolved by the market just with the renters offering like more to the owners? That's kind of my question. Why was necessary?
Very good, because remember, there are gains from trade, but there is also a price that the renter pays to the owners. And so while the gains from trade are large, once you subtract the price of the rentals, the renters are not making a huge amount of money. Okay, so it's not the case that the renter could pay twice as much, because that will make the whole thing unproductive. So indeed, if you trust our back of the envelope, the gains from trade are sort of bounded by some combination of the rental market price and the friction. And if you trust the back of the envelope, that tells us that, sure, the renters are a bit better off, but not hugely better off, because otherwise they would increase the price. That's exactly the argument. And renters are better off because now they're getting a higher price that is higher than what they would make if they were cultivating themselves the plot. But then you also have to factor in that they are bearing the friction cost, the search cost. And so again, they are a bit better off, but they are not hugely better off. In this sense, all this is marginal, because if it wasn't marginal, the market would take care of it without our subsidy, which I think is your question. Okay? So productivity goes up, but since people have to bear the friction to trade, and renters have to pay owners, the marginal benefits from owners and renters, if you trust the model, are relatively small.
Maybe this is the part that is hard for me to understand, because I kind of, for me, those frictions, maybe I understand from what you said, is the cost of looking for the renter, and and I didn't understand quite well how the subsidy kind of can cover this cost, or or how, yeah, so how that can.
It's a revealed preference argument, right? These transactions were not happening before. This means that for an owner, before our subsidy, the price that they will get from the renter was smaller than what the owners could get themselves from the plot, plus the friction, right? Otherwise, they would have traded without our subsidy. And now it must be the case that the price that they get from the subsidy, from the renter, plus our subsidy, is larger than what they can get from the owner, plus the friction cost of trade. It's a bit this graph, right? Like if the gains from trade were very large, the trade would happen without our subsidy. If the gains from trade are very small, they don't happen even with our subsidy. And that's a large share of people. And the ones that are induced to trade from our subsidy are the ones where the gains from trade are positive, let's say, but not huge. And these are the marginal trades. Anything else was going to happen already before, which I think is exactly the point of your question.
Well, I think it will be very interesting when you can see the other side of the coin, evaluating the effects of these subsidies on the renter side, right?
Absolutely, exactly. So some project I'm doing in Ethiopia is exactly about this. It's somewhat different setting. But of course, that's a big question. Like, are people who cannot access land benefiting from entering the market and getting land from larger owners? And how big are the benefits in terms of consumption and things like that?
Well, Lorenzo, thank you very, very much, and for your time and for presenting your work and the time we had to discuss previous to the seminar. And we certainly hope to keep talking to you and maybe work together in the future.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I also hope to have a chance to meet in person soon. And thanks to all the participants for all the questions and inputs.
Have a great evening.
Have a good day and a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.